So yeah, this evening I'm going to give you a rundown of the key highlights of Arctic alpine monitoring work ongoing at Ben Lawers, along with where we are now in terms of population trends of some of Britain's rarest plants. And the finding of our work has some really serious implications for biological conservation in the face of climate change. And I always love giving talks with lots of pictures of plants and also people working with them. So there's plenty of photographs that I've taken over the years to share with you this evening. And this talk is a slightly extended version of a talk that I gave in November to the BSBI Scots Botanist Conference. So if any of you were there, then some of this might be familiar, but hopefully there's a bit more to see as well. So just to introduce myself, I arrived at Ben Lawers in 2010 as a volunteer while doing my degree in ecological sciences at the University of Edinburgh. I was a volunteer for 3 seasons before then getting the job as the seasonal ecologist for the National Trust of Scotland at Ben Lawers starting in 2013. And I worked with the Trust until September 2020. And now from January 2021, I've been the Conservation Manager at Corrour Estate in the Central Highlands, working this job part-time alongside my ongoing PhD research into montane woodland restoration, which is based at the University of Stirling. But last summer, I also continued some of the rare plant monitoring at Ben Lawers as a contractor. So while working at Ben Lawers, I've kind of become the national expert in the plant called snow pearlwort, or Sagina nivalis to use its scientific name, which is kind of a really niche specialism, to be honest. It's a very, very rare plant. There's about 2,000 individuals in the whole of Britain, which all of them occur at Ben Lawers, apart from about 18 plants, which are on a nearby hill. And I feel that snow pearlwort particularly needs to be championed, not only for the reasons we'll see later in the talk, but also because such diminutive and inconspicuous plants tend to get forgotten about in favour of their more showier neighbours. So look out for much more on this particular plant, the snow pearlwort, throughout the talk. So while working at Ben Lawers for 7 years, I also started a family and had 2 children. So many of the summers I was doing field work at the site. I was either pregnant or breastfeeding mother, hence why there's quite a few pictures of me looking rather rotund because I was pregnant, and particularly with my second child, Felix, my son, was actually still climbing Ben Lawers and doing field work while 8 months pregnant, as shown on the photograph on the left here. And I was so committed to my children and my job that I would actually bring a 1-man bothy shelter up with me on the hill so that I could express milk for them while I was out doing field work. And to be honest, that's one of my proudest achievements throughout my time at Ben Lawers, is being able to do that. And I like to include it when I'm giving talks, particularly when I've been lecturing to university students, because I think it's really important to show that it's definitely possible to carry on doing this kind of ecological field work whilst starting a family. But that's kind of enough about me now, because it's really important to recognise that the content of today's talk is really a collective effort by many individuals over 4 decades. And I'm incredibly grateful for this and really grateful to be able to tell the story on their behalf, particularly to Dan Watson, who's been an ecologist at Ben Lawers, and property manager David Marden, and subsequently Helen Cole. And there's also been vital contributions from a long list of previous seasonal ecologists at Ben Lawers and NTS volunteers as well. And also thanks to some colleagues from the University of Stirling who've helped me with some of the data analysis of population trends and the paper that we're currently preparing for publication on this work. So let's talk a bit more about Ben Lawers, which is the study site for the population monitoring. And it's a mountain range in the Central Highlands in Perthshire, above Loch Tay, which contains Ben Lawers itself, the mountain, which is the 10th highest mountain in Britain at a height of 1,214 meters. But there's also 6 other Munro summits as well in the range. And the site is really highly designated, so it's a site of special scientific interest, a SSSI, a National Nature Reserve, which is an NNR, a special area of conservation, etc., etc. And the SSSI itself covers nearly 6,000 hectares, and the NNR, part of Ben Lawers, has been owned and managed by the National Trust for Scotland since 1950. And what's really special about this place is defined by the geology. It's composed of calcareous dalradian mica schists, and it's this combination of high altitude and the calcareous geology, which means Ben Lawers is home to the best collection of Arctic alpine plants in Britain, and in fact the highest density of nationally rare mountain plants. And as well as specifically important species, the place also has many nationally important habitats such as calcareous grasslands, alpine flushes, alkaline fens, and snowbeds. And it was the first NTS property that was purchased primarily for nature conservation. And the site is famous latterly for its pioneering habitat restoration work, particularly mountain woodland habitats. So here's some pictures of landscape scale habitat restoration work at Ben Lawers, wonderful sub-montane birch woods on the slope of Ben Glass. And then on the west side of Ben Lawers Road on Meon Ptarmigan, we have restored montane willow scrub habitat at higher altitudes, composed of this fabulous species, downy willow. And this is actually where I've been carrying out some of my PhD research. And then also as an aside, before we talk about the Arctic alpines, so the large herbivore exposure at Craighanlochen on Meon Ptarmigan was put up in 2000 to exclude sheep and deer from the site, and it's produced the best example of both restored montane willow scrub and upland tall herb habitat in Britain. So our vegetation monitoring at the site has been able to demonstrate that after the large herbivores were excluded, the grazing sensitive tall herbs were able to come off and proliferate off the cliff ledges where they'd been restricted to by overgrazing and come down into the grasslands below the cliffs. And the monitoring plots that we set up just before the fence was installed showed a huge increase in tall herb cover by nearly 30% plot cover after 18 years. So that's been a real conservation success story in terms of tall herb habitat. But the focus for this evening is on high altitude flora. So here's some of my favourite photographs of some of the famous plants occurring at Ben Lawers. So snow pearlwort I've mentioned, which is the really, really small, diminutive, cushion-forming plant. Most plants don't grow to more than 1 centimetre across, and this flower is only a couple of millimetres across. That's to give you an idea of just how small it really is. And then there's mountain bladder fern, which is this, it's quite a rare fern on Ben Lawers, but when it's found in exactly the right place, it can produce really dense patches, which are quite impressive. Alpine gentian in the middle is possibly the most famous plant on Ben Lawers, I think just because it's so very showy with these wonderful blue flowers, but it's actually quite unusual because it's an annual species and it grows in the calcareous grasslands below the crags, the calcareous crags. And then we've got alpine fleabane, which is another lovely beautiful coloured Arctic alpine. This time it's pink, and it's basically like a really sort of jazzed up daisy, a bit bigger and more showy in terms of colour. And then at the top is the drooping saxifrage. This is really unusual because it reproduces by vegetative spread using bulbils, red bulbils on the stems, which are clones of the plant rather than seeds, and it flowers very rarely in Britain. So I think it was last seen at Ben Lawers flowering in maybe 2009, and I was lucky enough to get this photo in 2019. So I'm very pleased to see that. And Snow Poa flowers, the flowers open only very rarely under the right conditions. And I think there's maybe been 5 people that have seen fully open flowers since the 70s. I don't know what happened before, maybe people did or not, but from what I know, since the 70s, only 5 of us have seen those. So that's, yeah, super exciting to get that photo. And most of these species in the photos and the previous slide are nationally rare plants. So that means the species occurs in 15 or fewer 10 kilometre squares in Britain. And some of these plants occur at Ben Lawers and nowhere else in Britain. For example, the bristle sedge in the middle often gets kind of overlooked because it's a sedge, maybe not as it sort of stunningly to look at as the sort of flowering, the showy flowers, the colourful flowers, but that is incredibly rare. And some of the other species have their most significant population occurring at Ben Lawers. And yeah, some of them are very strongly Arctic alpine plants in terms of their global distribution. This alpine forget-me-not here, I think that's one of the other famous plants, purely just because, again, the colourful flowers. Rock speedwell at the bottom left is really sort of distinctive bluey purple flowers, but they don't actually stay on for very long, so it's actually quite difficult to see them in flower, more than just the leaves, which is often what you get when you're monitoring them. So many of you might have heard about Ben Lawers and have been aware that it's important in a national context for rare plants, but it's actually incredibly important in a global context, an international context, because it's what we call in global change ecology a disjunct mountain outpost site. So that means that it has Arctic alpine species that occur here at the edge of their global range, typically at the lower latitude margins of their range, well away from the range core. And these kind of range edge populations can exhibit rare genetic diversity, local adaptations in comparison to the range core, and therefore they can contribute significantly to biodiversity and provide important functions within local plant communities. And of course, mountain areas in general are key biodiversity hotspots of ecological, hydrological, and socio-economic value. And so we have these disjunct Arctic alpine plant populations that persist on these mountain outpost sites, such as Ben Lawers, at the limits of their species range. And they're climate relics that offer us a really sensitive indication of global change effects. So major distributional displacement of Arctic alpine species is anticipated towards higher elevations and latitudes under climate change, but the disjunct populations restricted geographically to islands of suitable habitat may be vulnerable to extinction because their capacity for migration is very limited. And so the Arctic alpine flora of Scotland's mountains provides a really useful case study from which to explore this further. And investigating which groups of Arctic alpine plants are most threatened on these mountain outpost sites will be critical for developing targeted conservation action to preserve the valuable genetic resources and evolutionary potential that they have during global change. So that's really the crux of why 40 years of rare plant monitoring at Ben Lawers is so important in an international level. So going back to the beginning of the monitoring work, in the late 1970s, there was a concern that the rare Arctic alpine flora at Ben Lawers was declining. At that time, climate change wasn't on the radar particularly, so the concern was more due to historical over-collecting of the plants. So it was decided to initiate a population survey of some of the nationally rare plants occurring at Ben Lawers, particularly inspired by snow powerwort, actually, because it had disappeared from some of its most famous locations, and they weren't really sure if it was even around anymore. So that kind of kick-started the monitoring for that particular species, and then the others as well. So the monitoring work was managed by David Marden, the property manager, and 1981 is a really important year because his colleague Sandy Payne spent the summer recording all of the locations of most of the rare plants across the whole of Ben Lawers, along with kind of an initial estimation of their abundance, which is really an incredible achievement to map all of the known sites across Ben Lawers without the use of the kind of up-to-date records that we have and the GPS technology and photographs and everything. I just think it's phenomenal what he achieved in that year. And I love going back and looking over the old reports and just thinking how important it is to what we still do today. So after the initial baseline survey, the work was then repeated, the population surveys of these rare plants was repeated by property staff approximately every 6 years since. So on a repeated cycle of 6 years by whoever was the seasonal ecologist at the time. And this work involved visiting each known site for each species and updating GPS details, taking more photographs of the site, and most importantly, tagging and counting all the plants present. So the tags were used with these zinc nails with a strip of duct tape for the flag part. And they're really, really important for separating the search and find operation from the actual counting, which is done once all the plants at the location have been found. And sometimes the tagging itself can take a couple of hours because there's so many plants and they're so difficult to spot. So you'll spend a couple of hours tagging, and then once you're convinced you've got as many as you can, then at the end, take a photograph and then count all the tags as you gather them in. And it's really useful to have these tags because many of the Arctic alpines are so small and they seldom flower, and they look very, very similar to other common species. And I think this is snow powerwort again is a really good example of this. Some more photos just to show how difficult it is to work with. So it's a tiny cushion former, as I said, usually about 1 centimetre across. My daughter here, Georgia, she's pointing to a plant, and this is a really, really, really big individual. And so this is the finger of a 5-year-old pointing at a really, really large plant. And in the picture in the top right, there's maybe about 10 other plants I can see kind of dotted around that are just more like a kind of single rosette, and that's much more typical of an individual of snow powerwort. So yeah, very, very small, very difficult to spot, especially growing amongst the other vegetation and mosses and things which can look quite similar. And there's other species in the same plant family that do look very alike. This is one of my favorite comparisons between snow powerwort on the left and mossy sipho on the right, which I think is the species that I personally get most commonly confused with. There are other powerworts, particularly alpine powerwort, but it's the sipho that is the most deceptive and will still sometimes catch me out, even after doing this for years. Yeah, they do look very, very similar. Now, again, the snow powerwort that I've used in this photo is a particularly massive individual of maybe about an inch across. Most of the time it'll just be one rosette. And the same with the sipho, it can form dense patches, but you will also get single rosettes. And if you've got them next to each other, which does sometimes happen, it it's incredibly challenging, and takes years of experience to be certain that you've tagged the right plant. But when in doubt, I wouldn't tag it. But if you've got a hand lens with you, then you can look at the leaf, and that's definitive. So there is good feature. But it's very difficult to use a hand lens if you've got 500 plants that you've just tagged and to check each one. So here's some more photos of us at work. Then the work, as well as being difficult in terms of identification, is physically challenging because we often went to the tops of Munros, to very challenging terrain to work in. We could be anything from sort of kneeling all day in freezing wet alpine flushes to scrambling on steep and rocky terrain. Sometimes when I was working in August, I might have been known to wear as much as 8 layers of clothing to keep myself warm, with 2 pairs of hats, 2 pairs of gloves. That's in August. Sometimes we'll be out in October. And again, I'm quite proud of the photo on the left here because I was 6 months pregnant at the time and carrying out this work in these challenging environments. So what we end up with are these maps of all the locations of these rare species that we've been monitoring at Ben Lawers, and then counts of the number of plants at each of these sites to give a full population census. And the rare plant sites are distributed across Ben Lawers, so on the surrounding Munros in the NNR and SSSI, as well as on Ben Lawers summit itself. So population monitoring is essential for detecting changing trends, evaluating threats, and informing conservation management decisions. However, reliable botanical recording and monitoring continuity in mountain environments is often limited by remoteness, access, and challenging working conditions. So it's common to have surveys that are just a sample of a population. But what we've got at Ben Lawers is actually a unique data set, complete population counts for the whole site, which actually, in the case of Snow Pearlwort, basically represents a full count of the entire British population. And this has only been possible through this rigorous long-term monitoring programme and staff continuity. Many of these Arctic alpine plants are really difficult to survey, as I've shown. And if the location itself isn't enough of a challenge, you require highly specialised botanical knowledge. Without prior experience of the site and the flora, many species would be really, really difficult to identify with confidence and monitor to the same standard, especially as we were usually having to rely on vegetative features for identification rather than flowering. So now to show you what data we collected over time at Ben Lawers, the key findings from the monitoring work. And I'm going to focus on now 10 particular plant species here, because these are the 10 species that had full population counts done consistently and regularly since the 1990s. There's many other rare species at the site, including alpine gentian and the bristle sedge, which I've already mentioned. But for them, we don't have quite the same depth of data, usually because it wasn't feasible in their case to count every single individual. So this chart I've drawn up for the data, we've got the year on the bottom on the x-axis, and it only goes back to 1993 because this is the point I feel where we could be confident that we'd actually done the full population counts rather than estimates. Of course, I did say monitoring started in 1981. So this doesn't mean that anything prior to the 1990s isn't important. In fact, it's quite the opposite, really, because without the pioneering work, mapping the locations and everything, we wouldn't have had the knowledge with which to start the full population censuses with such confidence. So all the data here is really underpinned by the work that's gone back to the beginning of the 80s. So on the y-axis is the percentage of the baseline population. So what I've done is take the first survey in the early 1990s as the baseline, and all subsequent counts are calculated as a percentage of the baseline, with the 100% dotted line basically indicating there's been no change in population size since the early 1990s. I haven't used individual species counts, actual count values here for this chart, because it wouldn't really be possible to compare trends between the different species. Some of them had counts that ordered in the hundreds of plants, but others went up to several thousands of individuals. So having percentages here kind of standardizes population changes across all species in order to kind of understand the overall picture and compare trends between species. And most of these plants had about 4 surveys done from the early 1990s until the present day. So I'm going to go through the sort of changing fortunes of a few groups of the plants now. So first of all, this is the group that have shown population increases in the last 30 years. So mountain bladder fern, Cystopteris montana, is nearly 99% population increase. It's done really well. This is a fern of nice sheltered rock ledges. It can grow in really dense patches, as I've said, in the right conditions. Scorched alpine sedge and close-headed alpine sedge, they're found in very well vegetated stony flushes on the northern side of the Ben Lawers range. And we've got rock speedwell, which is a lovely herb of sheltered rock ledges. And I suppose it's important to point out here that the lines don't all go up to the present day, because monitoring was done every 5 or 6 years. So the data has just gone up to the most recent survey that we have. So next 3 species on the chart, alpine woodsia, another ferns, not shown too much change over the years. And then the lovely alpine fleabane, a bit of fluctuation, but in general stayed about the same population size. And then one of the favourite species of Ben Lawers, the alpine forget-me-not. So there's been, for this one, some decline, but it's not huge. You can probably anticipate what's coming up next. So unfortunately, these are the species that have shown significant declines since the 1990s. So the drooping saxifrage, the plant that reproduces by these red vegetative bulbils, and mountain sandwort, which is in the same family as the snow pearlwort. They've all declined by more than 50% since the 1990s, which is very worrying indeed, particularly for my own favourite, the snow pearlwort. And these are 3 are all plants of sparsely vegetated high altitude habitats such as snowbeds, and the 2 at the bottom, the mountain sandwort and the snow pearlwort, are very low growing cushion formers. So to kind of put it all together, there's been quite a varied picture. Some of the rare plants actually doing just fine, or even increasing over time. Yeah, there's a fair bit of fluctuation in trends, as you would expect with population dynamics. Although unfortunately, some of the plants have shown quite worryingly negative trends over time. And so with the help of my University of Stirling colleagues, we've also done some statistical analysis on this data using what's called negative binomial mixed effects models. This is using the raw count data for each individual site for these species across Ben Lawers. So yeah, as I said, each plant had a sort of number of dots on the map, as you were, where there's sort of individual discrete clusters or a sort of unique colony. So using the raw counts for each of these colonies, and then from that calculating, creating population level predictions using the negative binomial mixed effects model, which basically gives you the kind of prediction for what would be the average survey site across the Ben Lawers range. And so that's why the numbers on the y-axis are lower than on the previous, well, they're much lower than the sort of the whole population count, because it's a kind of average site across Ben Lawers. But the main thing is to see here is that for the 3 plants on the top, they're all increasing, going uptrend over time, which is statistically significant. And then the 3 on the bottom is that it's all strongly negative decline, particularly for the snow pearlwort. So yeah, we're really sort of statistical kind of backing that these trends are happening over time and that the populations haven't been stable over the study period. So kind of to put this now in the context of altitude, so that's obviously really important on a mountain site, particularly Ben Lawers, which is the 10th highest mountain in Britain. And so here are the same species, this time plotted with the most recent population count relative to the 1990s baseline, against the maximum altitude that they occur at on Ben Lawers. So there's actually a significant relationship between the two, between the maximum altitude at the site and population size from the most recent survey relative to the baseline, indicated by the trend line. So nearly 50% of the variation in population changes between species is negatively related to altitude. So this means that the species that have declined the most over time are also the species which occur highest up the mountain. We are 3 biggest decliners, and then also the Myosotis alpestris, the alpine forget-me-not, they're kind of all clustered here at the bottom right. So just to summarize some more figures for our 3 biggest declining species. So not only are these plants found higher up the hill than the others, they've actually also shifted their lowest altitudinal limit uphill, because we found that the lowest altitudinal sites that we monitored, the plants actually all disappeared from these sites, and so that means they became extinct at those particular locations. So earlier on in the monitoring at Ben Lawers, Saxifraga cernua, the drooping saxifrage, used to be found as low as 1,139 meters, and now currently its lowest altitudinal limit at Ben Lawers is 1,161, bearing in mind that the actual summit of Ben Lawers is 1,214 meters. So the lowest limit of this species is only 50 meters below the actual summit of the mountain. And also Sagina nivalis snow pearlwort used to be found at 840 meters. I've visited this site a lot now, and it's completely unrecognizable for being suitable snow pearlwort habitat anymore. Now the lowest altitude that this plant is found at in the whole of Britain is 915 meters. But also the 2 biggest decliners, the mountain sandwort and the snow pearlwort, they're actually found at the southern limit of their European range at Ben Lawers. So the 2 that have declined the most over time are also the most strongly Arctic species in terms of their global distribution. And of course, the decline in 66% in snow pearlwort represents basically a decline of 66% of the entire British population of this species, because as I said, bar about 18 plants, as that was in 2018, it's all of the rest of the plants occur at Ben Lawers in Britain. And also, crucially, these 3 plants are all low-growing plants which are found in sparsely vegetated habitats. So what's going on here? Why might we be seeing the declining trends? What might be the causes of this? So this is the final chart I've got to show. And again, the population size of the most recent survey relative to the baseline is plotted again on the left-hand y-axis, with species on the x-axis in descending order of change. And so what we had from our monitoring was a really excellent photographic record of each site. And so for each site, species were scored during the most recent survey, basically whether we thought that 50% of the site or more have been subjected to any of these particular visual changes between the current survey and the baseline using the photographic record. So what we can see here is basically the species that decline the most over time towards the right-hand side of the x-axis. They have actually had a higher proportion of sites that have been subjected to these pressures, from mostly landslip and rockfall, and some sheep trampling for Sagina nivalis snow pearlwort, but also importantly becoming more vegetated, basically being invaded by taller and denser vegetation. So nearly half of all Sabulina rubella, that's mountain sandwort, nearly half of all sites for that species had undergone vegetation encroachment, and over 80% of snow pearlwort sites have been subjected to all of these pressures in total, recorded at the most recent survey. So habitat type is really important here, because the three species that have declined the most, the dripping saxifrage, mountain sandwort, and snow pearlwort, they're all plants of open snowbed habitats that have bare soil, free from competition from much taller, more vigorous species. This is particularly true of the mountain sandwort and snow pearlwort because they're such small, low-growing cushion formers. They're really pioneer species of open ground and much more vulnerable to competitive exclusion by bigger plants and grasses and forbs and sedges that are invading the bare ground niches that they require for good growth and reproduction. So you can see here that the tags, the blue tags represent where the individual snow pearlworts are growing, and they're really kind of clustered in the bare soil areas, not growing amongst the thicker vegetation. And this contrasts with one of our increasing species on the left-hand side, Cystopteris montana, mountain bladder fern, which is much taller than snow pearlwort. I mean, it can grow to kind of 20 centimeters high easily, or 30 centimeters, the fronds. And it's quite happy growing in shady, densely vegetated habitats under rocky overhangs. It doesn't have the same requirement for these bare soil habitats as snow pearlwort. We do have some kind of species that are sort of in the middle of these two extremes. So I think the alpine forget-me-not's a really good example. It is associated with really high altitude at Ben Lawers. And it's shown a moderate decline of 32% over time. But I think it's maybe not declined as much as the others, the lower growing species, because it's fairly tall when it's flowering, and it does quite well in these herb-rich ledges surrounded by other tall plants, and it doesn't really have the same strict requirement for bare ground and vegetation-free habitats. So I think that's why it's kind of somewhere in the middle. It's maybe declined a bit, but it's holding its own, certainly in terms of the other species that have declined by over 50%. So to kind of summarize this diagrammatically, our declining species have been threatened by landslip and rockfalls coming in and sort of obliterating the sites. In some places it can be very dramatic. Some localized trampling, but particularly vegetation encroachment. And we think climate change is exacerbating this, particularly due to changes in snow lie. So snow cover is really important for stabilizing Arctic alpine communities and protecting them from erosive processes and extreme freeze-thaw cycles. So earlier snowmelt will alter vegetation phenology by lengthening the growing season, and this can then further facilitate the invasion of taller, more vigorous species which were previously restricted to lower elevations. So what we have under climate change is a process called biotic homogenization or mountain greening, i.e. upland vegetation becoming more similar over time as specialist Arctic alpines are replaced by generalist lowland plants. And the shifts in Arctic alpine floras are therefore occurring as a consequence of warming benefiting the more vigorous plants rather than it simply being a direct adverse effect of temperature change on high altitude species. And these observations are consistent with global predictions of climate warming induced reductions in high elevation floras and align with research showing global shifts in community composition on mountain summits and accelerated declines in range edge low latitude populations of Arctic alpine plants. So although upward migration of species is occurring worldwide, these disjunct populations already situated at local maximum elevational gradients, like plants at Ben Lawers, could face mountaintop extinction in the future because there's really simply no higher ground left for them to retreat to as temperatures rise. And what's more, the two species that we found that declined the most are also the two species that have their most southern European limit occurring at Ben Lawers. So the most strongly Arctic alpine species are the ones that we would expect to be most strongly affected by climate change. And it's often been talked about this mountaintop extinction as a potential climate change scenario, but here we have real scientific evidence of it occurring now in Scotland. So the talk that I've just given is based on our work for our upcoming paper that's basically about to be submitted in the next couple of days, which we've called Riding the Elevator to Extinction, Disjunct Arctic Alpine Plants of Open Habitats Decline as their more competitive neighbours expand. And the paper's culmination of these decades of plant monitoring at Ben Lawers. So just finish by summarising some of the key messages. We've got a comprehensive long-term data set which encapsulates the emerging threat of global climate change on biodiversity. The plants at Ben Lawers are disjunct populations persisting at the limits of their species range and therefore of international importance. There's been divergent trends, but population changes have been are significantly related to altitude. 3 Arctic alpine specialists have suffered severe declines of over 50% of their population size in just 27 years and become extinct at their lowest altitudinal locations. And so I think snow pearlwort, mountain sandwort and dripping saxifrage should be considered at risk of extinction in Britain. And the other species, although they're still rare Arctic alpines in Britain, they're not quite as fussy in their requirement for low competition as the others, and they've been less infected by vegetation encroachment. And they're less dependent on the requirement for extreme high altitude and the associated climate of snow-covered mountain tops. So just to conclude, the results of the study have this is a unique case study at Ben Lawers with a strong global message that disjunct mountain plant populations are under serious threat from climate change and biotic homogenization, which has major implications for regional biodiversity hotspots where they occur. And I think this work highlights the urgent need for mitigation measures to tackle the dual climate change and biodiversity crises. And so we need real targeted conservation action now to protect these plants and their habitats before we lose them and lose the genetic diversity and cultural and inspirational value that these rare species represent. So I think now working on building up ex situ collections of these plants is going to be really important conservation work to protect the flora of Ben Lawers into the future. So to finish, I just think it's important to recognise why this is important, because we all know climate change is happening, but should we really be concerned about the loss of these particular plants at Ben Lawers when there's so many other more pressing implications of climate change? I've talked about the international importance of the site in terms of biodiversity and range edge distributions, but there's other reasons why we should care about the fate of these plants, which kind of moves away from the science and the numbers and kind of more into realms of emotional response that we might have to plants and rare species, because losing them is losing cultural and inspirational value. So to use myself as an example, when I came to Ben Lawers as a student, I was kind of quite broad in my where I wanted to go in ecology. I hadn't really made up my mind whether it's plants or animals, almost more leaning towards behavioural ecology. But being at Ben Lawers very quickly turned me absolutely into a botanist and plant scientist. Getting to know these plants is really important for kind of building up my own confidence as a botanist and researcher, but also inspiring my love of plants and habitats and vegetation in general. And because of that inspiration, I've now become a conservation manager carrying out landscape scale ecological restoration and climate change mitigation. And I'm not sure that I would have ended up doing that if I hadn't started caring so much about these Arctic alpine plants at Ben Lawers and their habitats. So many people might be inspired by Ben Lawers, even just by the fact that it exists. And, people have important species or plant communities that influence them in their lives in a really meaningful way, and inspire them into more general love of nature and to get involved in conservation work or natural science. And so to lose those species or habitats, even if they never existed in the first place for people to enjoy, would be such a great shame, because without these unique floras and rare species, our lives would be so much less richer. We'd be much less inclined, I think, to fight for nature conservation and preservation of biodiversity. So it's important, I think, to keep that experience alive for the next generation, such as my children, my daughter Georgia, pictured here with drooping saxifrage, which she was lucky enough to see for herself. Possibly the youngest person in Britain to see all these plants together out on the hill. I've got no proof of that, but I wonder at 5 years old whether she might be. And I hope that we can continue to conserve them so that other children like her and adults, the next generation, still have them to enjoy for the future. So that's all from me. It's been really nice to talk to you all, and it's been a real honour and a privilege to be involved with these rare plants for the last 10 years. And I hope that I can continue in some way to do so. I'm really grateful for the experience at Ben Lawers, and to be able to share it with you. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. This is my son pictured in a baby grow that my colleagues kindly bought for me because they knew how much I love snow pearl. So.
Wonderful. Well, Sarah, that was a fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it very much. So the amount of research that has gone on at Ben Lawers is outstanding. And I'm so glad you're going to publish a paper very soon about it all.
Hopefully. We still have to go through the whole review process and everything, but I mean, yeah,
it's wonderful. No, it's a fantastic piece of research, I think. And I am so glad you are involving the next generation and showing it to them. That is wonderful, really is.
I don't know if anyone's got any questions, if people are still on mute.
No,
or they might have to unmute themselves. I don't know how it works.
Yeah. Any questions?
I've got someone holding up.
Hello, yes, it's me, Brian Ballinger. Hi, wonderful talk. Can I just check? I mean, it's always been seen as a very good thing to take the sheep and deer off, but you talk about plants being overgrown. I don't know whether the sheep went up that high. I mean, are there any negative effects from the reduction in grazing I know you've been trying to achieve very much?
Yeah, it's a really important question because it's not a simple, clear-cut answer of removing the sheep, and it's all wonderful because thinking about my own experience with montane willow scrub, so that's obviously impacted by overgrazing of willows, the adult plants and the young plants. But for the next generation, for the seedlings to germinate, the seed needs bare soil patches. So if you completely remove the herbivores, as we have done at Ben Lawers, it's fantastic for allowing the growth of the planted individuals. But there's a worry that there'll be too much vegetation to facilitate regeneration. Although we are seeing some now in some of the landslip sites which create bare soils. So yeah, it's going to be very interesting to follow that. And there's some of the Arctic alpine plants, particularly the alpine gentian, do grow in the kind of more grazed habitats, and there's been work showing that actually they do struggle when the grazing is completely removed. So that's why I would definitely say, yeah, we wouldn't want to remove grazing for that purpose. And even snow pole or just trampling is definitely can cause loss of plants, but one of the biggest sites does actually occur in a location where I've seen plenty of sheep about. So yeah, it's really species specific. It's more tall herb vegetation and the montane willows, the really palatable plants that removing or dramatically decreasing grazing is good for, but you have to find the balance. Some hands up.
No.
Claire's got a hand up on.
Yeah, thank you. I was wondering whether you've got sort of climate data for Ben Lawers area, like temperature, but also rainfall, whether that's becoming more frequent or heavier and whether that might have an impact.
Yeah, it's really important to monitor the climate. Definitely. The NTS put in a weather station on Muirnan Ptarmigan a few years ago now, maybe 5 years. I can't remember exactly the date it went in, with kind of the view, of monitoring that in more detail, having site-specific data. There is data from near Ardronnig on the other side of the loch, and observations of snow cover, which have been used to model projections in snow cover over time. So they can sort of be used to go back further into the past, but hopefully the now having this weather station will kind of be useful for rainfall data and stuff into the future. And because of that, I thought it was so important. That's inspired me to get a weather station at Corrour as well, because I thought it was so wonderful what the NTS have done. That there should be more of that mountain weather stations specifically in Scotland.
Definitely, it's good. Thank you.
Well, I think that there are a few things in the chat. In the Q&A, are there?
Have we got a question about dandelions? I think I can just about make out, but you're on mute. There we go.
Somebody's muting me.
We can hear you.
It's not me.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, that's good.
So you've forgotten one, Sarah. Same distribution.
Oh, well, Cymblifolium is the Ben Lawers dandelion.
But it's got exactly the same distribution as all your other rare plants.
Yeah, so that's definitely a good point. That's one of the ones that hasn't been monitored in the same way. I think
Because you can't do it, I suppose.
Yeah, it requires such a specialist knowledge. We did have Tim Rich come out with this in, let me think, 2016.
I was speaking to him on the phone. I told him where to go at the time. With Dan Watson.
Yeah, so that was brilliant. That was one of my favourite days, actually.
Oh, you were there. Good.
Yeah, it was wonderful.
The trouble is you don't get the picture. Can you see me? Look.
Yes, yeah.
So you need to get the new book, but Tim's pictures are not very good ones.
Yeah, so it's a shame actually, because I had my camera with me as well. They probably weren't any better than Tim's.
No.
The memory card was corrupted, so my photos, I never got them.
Well, they're almost impossible to get a photograph that looks like they do in the far north. So if you had pictures from Iceland, they show the leaves that really look like boats, but they don't up there unless you grow them in a pot.
Yeah.
So I try to grow them in a pot, and I gave some to Killin, but they die at lower altitudes. They can't stand the heat.
Yeah.
So one of the things is that you didn't say, some of these things will just not grow at lower altitudes. And it's because they're adapted to long days in summer, light, but then they go to sleep in the winter and things eat them.
Mm. Yeah, so that might be a problem. It's not going to be easy if we do think about going down the exit.
Certainly impossible, I would say.
And even for things like germination of seeds, I don't know whether that's dependent on temperature.
Well, you see, with dandelions, they could easily spread, but they won't grow anywhere else. Not these. They're very specialized. I don't know what exactly, but
yes, we have to keep them in glass houses with really cold temperatures or something.
Well, you mentioned that Saxifraga cernua doesn't often flower, so presumably it never sets seed.
Yeah, not in Scotland.
But why is that? Is it because the plant has evolved? Has it changed?
Well, yeah, I mean, vivipara is quite a sort of common Arctic alpine adaptation to kind of have it.
But how does it adapt? Is it a different variety, or is it just simply phenotypic? Yeah,
so it's thought that all the Scottish plants are basically one single clone.
Well, they must be if they're vegetated.
Yeah. So it's maybe just the kind of climate relict aspect that it's just this sort of really isolated population that's ended up being a single clone. So I think they crossed some plants with Norwegian pollen and were able to generate seed. But
so they're out crossing, are they?
I think that research was done quite a while ago. It's not been followed up, which we really should do. But yeah, they were able to cross with Norwegian plants, but not with themselves.
You see, dandelions are also vegetative, but they're seed vegetative in that they're apomictic.
Mm-hmm.
So they can actually blow around a bit, which is one advantage.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm hoping to see them sometime, but don't forget them.
No, definitely not. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, it would have been definitely in the talk if I had a photo, but like I said, my memory.
I'll send you a good one. You can find it online.
Oh, brilliant.
But the best photographs come from Spitsbergen.
I'll definitely have to go there then as well.
Oh, no, but they're online.
Oh, thanks.
No. Lynette says, thank you for a talk, and she remembers looking for Saxifraga Sagina nivalis with Sandy in the early 1980s, and they found a hedgehog near the top of the mountain.
That's remarkable.
Yes.
Wow.
Well, there are moles up there as well.
Moles, yes.
Yeah.
I suppose it isn't that high, in a way. If they're worms, you'll find moles.
Yeah.
Can I
Yes.
ask a question? I just wondered about the other colonies of these things. Some of them occur in other places in Scotland, don't they? For instance, Veronica fruticans occurs above Balquhidder. I can't remember the name of the mountain now.
Yes.
And it's right at the very top of it. I just wonder if anybody's monitoring these other sites. There was one in Shetland too, wasn't there?
Buy them in garden centres.
Can you? Yeah.
They'll grow in your rock garden.
Well, I'm just wondering what the wild ones are doing.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, mountain sandwort. I think we're going to try and hopefully monitor some of the other populations not being done as regularly as Ben Lawers. There's populations on the Kenwell and Ben Alder and Ben Hope. So I really think they need to be done to see if similar trends.
We actually monitored with Liz. There's a group of us who've been more than once to Balquhidder and monitored and counted the plants, I think.
That would make a very interesting kind of comparative study.
That's right, isn't it, Liz? I'm not sure if I've got the records, but I might have.
I remember, I don't remember counting them, but I remember seeing them up. It's right at the top of Kirkton Glen.
That's it.
Before you go over and down the other side.
They look much better plants than the ones you had too.
Oh.
Yes, I think I remember it. That's where I saw Veronica fruticans for the very first time.
It's in a limestone pavement.
Yeah.
Yes. Lots of gentians up there. Really nice flora. Yeah.
But yeah, snow pearlwort only other grows on Ben Heskyneth. As far as we know, there may be more that we still to look for. There's another Munro that there's a very slim chance that could have.
Yes.
But, yeah, basically all at Ben Lawers apart from 17 plants.
Has any monitoring been done at Ben Heskyneth?
I don't think so. Well, yeah, Sandy, so he was the one that found it there in 1981. And we went back in 2018 to check, and he actually had, it was a really good photo, showing kind of half the corrie with a circle around a rock feature, which we were able to find spot on. And then I got to there and I was like, there's a plant. It was sort of one of those perfect moments, because sometimes, you get a much more vague photo of kind of a whole hill. I mean, it must have been so much harder to work without cameras that we have today, where you can just snap pictures all over the place. But that was really useful, and the sort of details of the site meant we found it. And there was another one on Stabinian, but we went there in 2020, and I think it's gone from there because all the habitat didn't seem right anymore, and there's been quite a bit of erosion. So yeah, it's just Heskyneth and Ben Lawers range now.
Do you think it might re-establish it at lower altitude if the vegetation was right for it, if there was sparse vegetation areas?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Yeah, it's that issue of whether it would grow well in warmer temperatures or not. I suppose we've got to see. To try these things and find out if it's possible to cultivate it or not. I think Edinburgh Botanics has already got some seed of mountain sandwort from last summer. Dan collected that, so we'll see how that gets on.
It's fascinating. Yeah. And it's such a good scientific study. It's wonderful to have had all that work done.
Yeah, no, I'm so grateful to everyone that did all the hard work and the monitoring before I joined this, and I just saw how important it was. You know, we had all the figures on the spreadsheets and in the reports, and I kind of thought, well, we really need to tell this story widely now, and that's why we're going to try and get it published.
Yes, so good to get it published. Really, really good.
Champion the case for these plants, particularly the more inconspicuous ones.
Well, thank you so much for giving us a brilliant talk. Claire, do you want to say something?
Yeah, sure.